Thanks, Lacey. Really appreciate that. Hey, this is awesome. I'm super excited to be putting this talk forward, and this is my first time doing this particular talk. It's something that comes up a lot when I talk to developers who are getting into the Jamstack and sort of kind of figuring out what's where their solutions and their use cases fit in. So yeah, let's do this. All right, so this is the big long slideshow. Hopefully I don't refer to my notes too much, but you can slap me if I do. Okay, here we go. Who am I? My name is Joel Vardy. Follow me on Twitter at Joel Vardy. This is me and my kids. I got father of teens. I'm also a high school football coach, which is what I really miss right now. I love musical theater. I super miss that as well. But I'm a lifelong developer, and I 100% believe that you should always be learning. And for those of you who are new to development, it's okay. I'm new to the Jamstack just as much as anyone because it's a pretty new kind of concept. It hasn't been around that long, and it changes all the time. So it's okay to feel like, oh my gosh, I'm not sure what's going on right now. That's okay. I feel like that a lot after multiple decades. I'm also president at Agility CMS, which is a pretty cool headless CMS company. So go check that out. It's going to be great. Thanks to the people putting my free stock photos in here from Unsplash and Pexels. Thought I'd give you guys a shout out. If y'all need stock photos, go there. This is the most important slide though, because the idea of conferences like this is a chance for us to learn from each other. We're on a journey together. And as developers, your voice matters. People are listening to developers. They're listening to you. And I'm hoping that we can all get better at explaining concepts like Jamstack and software architecture much, much better. And on that note, get yourself on tech Twitter and follow this human because she's awesome, super smart. This was a really good tweet she put up a few days ago. Jamstack's about building web applications in the same style as mobile apps. The UI is compiled and then the data is pulled in as needed. That's a really great sort of way to kind of think about what Jamstack can do. So thanks, Cassidy, for putting this out there. Cassidy's from Netlify, pretty awesome human, and a lot of the folks at that company are really good to follow. Netlify, Gatsby, all these sort of Vercel, a bunch of these companies have really great people in them that are really helping folks to learn how to do stuff in the Jamstack. So there's kind of two kinds of solutions I want to talk about that make up what I think of as like full stack. We have apps and we have APIs. Apps have a UI and APIs like a kind of like a backend, right? So let's break our development down into that. So you're going to apps, you think of like static websites. Think of, it could be a dynamic website. Those are two kind of different things. You could have mobile apps in there, just like Cassidy was saying. We could have a website, mobile app is the same kind of idea. We could have a smart TV app. We could be writing apps that are everywhere, all these places. So it's pretty much anything with a UI. APIs, on the other hand, I think of them, they expose some kind of data. They're going to perform some kind of action. They're going to do something. They're going to manipulate that data maybe, and they might call another API. They're just sort of passing things along. Sometimes we call that proxying. All kinds of things you can do there. So it is an API-driven world, and we're just living in it, kind of thing. But so the API is kind of, we talk about the separation of concerns. I've heard that come up a lot. Sort of separating an app from an API is a really smart thing to do. Headless CMS is one of the things where it's like, a lot of us were on WordPress at one point, or a traditional CMS where it's like, it's all in one big thing, and then we split it apart. It's like, that's the app and the API. And your world is full of that too as a developer. So in terms of full stack, it kind of means worrying about all of it at the same time. And what I'm hoping to do is help you to break that down a little bit into different kinds of concepts. So you can sort of say how I want to put my app together in this particular use case. Just going to keep an eye on Zoom to make sure I'm not getting any messages. Okay, here we go. So we have front-end development and we have back-end development. So in front-end development, we're going to have like JavaScript that runs in a browser, right? It's pretty simple. We're going to have CSS. We're going to have HTML, all the things that are going to be in there that are going to run on the front end. It's going to have, that's anything with a visual design, anything that's part of my design system. That's front-end type stuff, right? But in the back end, we have server code. Also could be JavaScript, could be any language though, right? We could have database type stuff. We don't hear much about database talk in a Jamstack conference because there's a lot of front-end developers that are here, but it's a really important concept to understand. We have things like caching, which we do not want to talk about, but it's like one of the most important things for back-end sort of conversations. With the idea of like a system architecture, and we have multi-tier systems. So back-end kind of sounds a little more old school to me, but it doesn't have to be. When we talk about things like serverless functions and things like that, you could think of that as a backend, which is a less scary way to think of it. And we're going to talk about some APIs that are kind of new in the world, that are more modern, that are not so scary. But then a monolith, and we talk about an app that you heard the word monolith or classic type apps. It's where they put the front end and the back end all together. They don't separate the concerns, like we said before, of the app and the API. And that kind of makes me like, that's no fun at all. That's not a good concept these days. I think that's something we want to try and avoid. So with these kind of concepts as an understanding of these, one of the most important things as a Jamstack developer is, where is my code running right now? Because a lot of it's JavaScript or TypeScript that's compiled into JavaScript, but where is it happening? Like, where is it actually executing? It could be the browser. It could be the server, if you're running something like something that's running live on a server right now, or it could be at build time. And this is like, if you run something like Gatsby or Next.js or whatever, you might have seen like stuff that's in a console. That usually an indication of where your code is running. And sometimes the same code will run in both places. So this is, as a developer, really important to kind of get an understanding of where your code is running, especially if you're using someone else's framework that might make that a little hard to understand. I know Gatsby and Next.js for sure, you can actually have the same React component that runs at build time as a part of the build to generate a static website. And then that same component gets what they call rehydrated and runs on the browser. And that can be, when you're first getting into it, it's a little tricky. And I think Jamstack kind of plays mind games with us in this case. It's like, whoa, where's everything going? I don't really know. So let's think about that for a second. Let's just kind of break it down from a framework type perspective first. We have frameworks. We talk about React, Vue, there's Svelte, which is one of my favorite ones. A lot of people talked about Angular. So we normally think of these as front-end frameworks because they were built mostly to manipulate the DOM in the browser or to have some way of getting the UI as part of an app, right? But then we have these hybrid frameworks. Some call them static site generators, but they've become a little more than that. It's a little more complex for some cases. I call them hybrid frameworks. So Next.js is, I think, probably the one of the ones that's like, it definitely is like, don't call us a Jamstack framework. We're a hybrid framework. This is where you can have something like, it can take those React components like Next and Gatsby, takes those React components, it can kind of compile them into static HTML and CSS JavaScript at build time, and then have things that run at runtime. Nuxt is very similar to like Next, except for it's for Vue. And you have 11t, which is, again, doesn't have a framework that it uses, it doesn't use React or Angular or anything like that. But these are sort of, this code is going to run in the build server and then maybe at other times as well. Well, then we have the concept of serverless functions, okay, which comes out of nowhere. It's like, what is this thing? These are running on kind of like a server, but it's serverless. What does that mean? It gets a little confusing. They can also run JavaScript. They're not quite serverless. This running on a server somewhere. It's not running in your browser. It's usually called from your browser. We'll look at that from a diagram. There's no UI for these, right? So you might have first heard of this. The first kind of concept was actually from AWS. They were called Lambda functions. But then this kind of like copycat for Azure functions, which are, sort of the analogous thing for Azure that AWS has. Google has their own thing. But then you have companies like Netlify and Vercel, which have this as part of their offering as well. And I think we're starting to see this explode because it's a lot easier to set up a serverless function in Netlify or Vercel than ever before, and to test it too. And what really kind of cooks my noodle is that the idea that a framework like Next.js has functions included as part of its architecture as a hybrid framework. So if you're thinking of building what you would consider a full stack solution, it needs a little more functionality than just a static website. It needs to have a whole bunch of things. We need to call a bunch of APIs. We need to write some APIs and do a bunch of things. Next.js is a good place to start on this. So let's dig into Next.js just a little bit more. Just kind of see what it does as a hybrid framework. And this is just an example. I think a lot more frameworks are going to go this way and sort of work in a way that's not too dissimilar from this. So it's a static site generator. So, there's code that runs at build time to build your site. You can also do server-side rendering with this. So you could run Next.js in like a Docker container to run everything at server-side as a dynamic website where there's nothing statically generated. That can totally happen. It has the idea of functions built in. You have, basically put JavaScript files in a folder called API, and they can run as serverless functions. And depending on where you actually host your site, they will run in a different way on a different server. If you host them on Netlify, they'll run in Netlify. If you host them on Vercel, they run in Vercel. But you can host it in Azure too. So it's really interesting. It has preview mode, right? So because it's like, and that one is a big one. Gatsby has its own way of doing preview, but Next.js has this built-in, like you can have the same code run on, Netlify or Vercel, and it can do preview as well. So it's pretty cool. It also has this idea of incremental static regeneration, which is like connecting the static build with a function that runs at sort of runtime. So after it's already been built, it can like add on to the build. So that's kind of like, my head starts to explode at this point, right? So there's a lot that can go on in Next.js. I could do a whole session on that. But one of the things that they've started doing is Next.js has like, they've got a commerce example of like a fully featured like e-commerce example. And they've got another one for conferences. Actually, Agility and a bunch of other CMSs are included in there as examples in their virtual conference software that they've used for their conference. So some pretty cool examples with Next.js. It's worth looking at. But I think the most important thing to do here, understanding that's like, we'd like to get to the idea of understanding when to use certain kind of frameworks and certain kind of deployments. Let's look at some exampple here. I'm just going to keep in my watch because I'm going really fast and I want to make sure I have enough time. Okay, I think I've got lots of time. So remember to ask those questions in the chat because I'm not looking at the chat just yet. Okay, so Next.js is a really good place to start for full stack types of solutions, and we'll dig into more about the individual features and functionality of those solutions as we follow the flow of our code. Okay, so let's follow the flow of the code as it goes from like a repo out to the UI. Okay, so we're going to check our code into source control, and we're going to merge a pull request, something like that, and our code is going to land in the main branch. Boom. And somehow that's going to trigger a build. So that's where our code runs at build time. And that's the starting point for just about every Jamstack solution, okay? Whether it's Eleventy or Gatsby or Next or whatever, it's going to do that. And it's going to call a bunch of build time APIs. Two of the biggest ones are like, of which are like your headless CMS. So it's going to pull in the content that it needs to for like SEO and stuff to build the HTML pages. It could be e-commerce where it's like, if I'm selling some products, I'm going to want to build those in and they're part of the static website. There may be other build time APIs as well, but that's going to happen just once and then it's built. Boom. Okay. And by the way, that build process is often triggered not just by code check-ins, but sometimes by something called webhooks. So regardless of how it's triggered, that code runs on a build server, not a web server, and runs and generates your static site. So boom, it's there, ready to go. And now we can hit it through our browser, through a CDN and all that sort of stuff. I'm glad this session is kind of later on of these 2-day sessions because you guys have already had all the sort of details about how this works. But if you're still not sure, that's okay. I'm still figuring out how some of this works too. What's really interesting here is that this is kind of like what Cassidy was saying at that tweet in the beginning where we generate the static site. It's not unlike when I generate a mobile app that might run, in my phone that is going to now call some APIs. Okay, it's got everything ready to go. And as we know, JavaScript in the browser or a mobile app running on my phone or a TV or any of these things that are all running JavaScript, by the way, they can call a serverless function. Okay, so these serverless, I call it APIs, but they're really serverless functions. It's kind of like my own API that I would write for my site kind of thing, right? So all of the backendy type stuff, I can put in a serverless function. So we can invoke those functions using, HTTP fetch or XHR calls. There's a bunch of different terms. They used to be called AJAX calls. That's part of this is all part of our DevOps now, right? And it could either be part of the same deployment that put those serverless APIs out there, or we could deploy them separately. It's all just a matter of sort of addressing them, right? And we'll get into those diagrams later. Okay, so let's keep on following the flow of this code as it goes through here. What are we going to do when we write our serverless API? Why would we do that? Well, the most important one I saw that I've seen a lot of today is like authentication. Okay, I have a static website and I want to put a spot in there for users to register. That doesn't make any sense really for me to statically generate, a list of users and have that available. That doesn't make any sense. So I'm probably going to call an API for authentication, right? And probably going to have some kind of data. If I have a database, that's probably going to be something where, I may have something from my database. Say I have a list of like movies or something that's in my database, or some other thing that I need to render statically. But oftentimes things that are in a database are stuff I need to pull in dynamically. So I would do that there. Any messaging. So if my app is sending emails, things like that, that maybe could belong in a serverless API. Sometimes you send text messages, whatever. Any data processing. So it's like, hey, I need a trigger function that's going to update a bunch of counts and do some aggregations or whatever. Now we're totally talking like backend type things, right? Data processing is a big one that can happen in a serverless API. And we could be calling just other APIs that do things, okay? A few examples of these things in terms of like brand names. Auth0 is a big one. Auth0 is big for authentication. Netlify has an identity API. There's Okta. There's all kinds of authentication APIs out there now. A lot of them with great free packages. By the way, I think pretty much everything I talk about today has a free offering. All these are basically put out there so you as developers can figure it out without having to pay for it. And that's really important. That's kind of a new idea well, it's not new. This is how we get developers into stuff is, put it a free offering, see if it works for you, go with it. Fauna is amazing for databases. Sendgrid, Twilio Sendgrid's amazing for like sending emails. There's a ton of APIs out there for that too. Zapier, data processing. A lot of people use like Zapier. Cloudinary is another one. It's like an other API that does tons of like media stuff and images and videos, kinds of crazy stuff you can do. So you can basically put together an app that does a ton of great things and add features and functionalities from these APIs, from serverless APIs that do things. So it can be really confusing though, because if you just go like, I'm going to search on NPM and look at Cloudinary, I'm going to find tons of different things that can talk to Cloudinary, right? Or tons of different things that talk to Sendgrid or Stripe for e-commerce or, whatever. So it can be kind of hard to pick those through. So you want to sort of understand, but if you understand where your code is running, okay? So if I go and I find an Auth0 React control, well, that's probably going to run in the browser, right? So that's made for browser code to run in there. But if I want to have a login API, I probably need to look for a Auth0 API or SDK for backend calls, okay? So it's important to understand where that code is running. But I'd like to dig into databases for a second. It's 0% fun, but it's one of those hard questions that comes up a lot about how things kind of work, all right? So Fauna is a kind of a database, right? I would say it's kind of like a new school database. But then think about, a lot of people have data in SQL Server. So it can sit in Azure, but it could be anywhere. And then there's like something like Azure, Amazon Neptune. These are just 3 examples. There's a zillion databases, MySQL databases, all kinds of stuff. So, but if I'm using something like Fauna is like a new school type system. It's pretty modern. It was built as a database service to be called from anywhere. It's globally distributed, right? So it's designed for those serverless functions. So if you're going to run that, you could run that easily from, I think, anywhere, okay? But Azure SQL Server or just SQL Server or MySQL, whatever, that's kind of old school, right? It's more of like a server as opposed to serverless. And I would say it's kind of an attack vector, right? A lot of places, a lot of sort of websites that get like hacked, it's because they put like SQL calls right somewhere where it's like too easy to get to, or or it wasn't behind a firewall or something like that. So that can be a sort of a danger, danger as an idea. It was designed really for intranets first, right? As a special port and all that sort of stuff. So it's not in the same kind of sort of category as like a database like Fauna. Then you have Amazon Neptune, okay, which is like it is sort of new school-ish. It's cloud scalable, it's super flexible. It's also kind of an attack vector because you don't want it to be like wide open, but it's designed for like hyperscale, massive type solutions. So these are like, there's lots of different databases out there. These are 3 different examples. But if you're going to call something like Fauna, perfect for something like Vercel or Netlify functions, okay, because it doesn't have to be in the same kind of resource group. Whereas I would say if you're going to write something that calls into Azure SQL Server, you probably want to write an Azure function. Or if you're going to call something that runs against Amazon Neptune, might make sense to call an AWS Lambda function for that. Okay, it makes sense to do that. You can still write those functions and call them from any front-end static app. Okay, it doesn't need to be in the same app. So I can write an app that runs a Gatsby app that's deployed in Netlify that calls my Azure functions, because I could do, especially if like when you talk about your DNS, it could be like, www.mysite.com, and I host my Azure function at api.mysite.com, which happens to be in Azure. So that way my function is close to my server, to my database server, okay? Let's like visualize that a little bit more. So, Fauna, let's call those from Netlify or Vercel. That's cool. Those are like global APIs, instantly scalable, no problems, don't have to worry about that. Let's build an Azure function. Now it's like joined with the Azure resource for something like SQL Server. So it's going to be in the same spot. Because Azure SQL Server is really chatty too, like you get a lot of network calls back and forth. This is really good because I'm not going to pay for that network traffic between my function and my server if they're in the same resource group. And the same deal with Amazon, with my Lambda functions. It's an AWS resource in the same sort of affinity, okay? So we can think of this, are your APIs, think of them, are they like edge-to-edge APIs? Are they built for being sort of global and anywhere? Or do they require some kind of resource affinity? And the easy rule of thumb is if you have a bunch of stuff in Azure, keep it in Azure. Try to keep it in the same resource group. That just makes sense. And if you have a bunch of stuff already in AWS, you don't want to move it, write in a Lambda function that does that, okay? You can still build websites that have things in multiple places. And this is where it's kind of like hard to sort of say what's the right and wrong solution for doing something like this. But these kind of architectures are important. So, we have basically some kind of Jamstack solution to generate our static website. Got that. We need something to call these APIs to go get our data, to do processing, things like this. And if you're in a database, these are the kind of decisions that you should be making. And you might want to make these decisions about all the different things that you're accessing: search, e-commerce, authentication, all those different things. So let's dig into a couple of patterns, okay? So I call these Jamstack architecture patterns that I think of when I'm recommending solutions for customers that come to us, okay? So we have the idea of what I call static plus edge, okay? So as I said, so it's like any static site generator, and then you could use something like Vercel or Netlify functions, okay? And it calls any other APIs that you want. The second category would be like what I call hybrid. Hybrid, so there's something like Next.js plus edge, where you have a Next.js function, or sorry, a Next.js website or app, however you want to call it, that's deployed to Vercel or Netlify and has Vercel or Netlify functions that run in it, okay? And you can just call whatever other APIs that are meant for sort of edge-to-edge access. And then you have what I call static plus cloud. So again, any static site generator, but it's going to call AWS or Azure functions to access internal cloud resources, okay? And you can do a little bit of mix and matching here, but in general, if I have an Azure resource that I'm accessing, I should write an Azure function for that, and so on and so forth with any other of the sort of major cloud providers like AWS, Google, and Azure. Let's look at what the first one looks like. So this is static plus edge, okay? So I have my static website. So the build process generated that static website. Now my browser fetch, so like XHR calls or AJAX calls, whatever you want to call them, they're going to call those serverless functions. Those serverless functions can now call basically all the APIs in the world that are kind of meant for living on the edge, okay? So like that again, authentication, database, same as when we talk about messaging, so we call Sendgrid, data processing with like Zapier or something, e-commerce, so your Shopify APIs or Stripe APIs or whatever. Again, a lot of different vendors here, right? UGC is another one. So it's like, hey, I want to have comments on my website. Sometimes you want to run the UGC calls through your serverless functions. Sometimes you can, by the way, sometimes you can call right from your static website, you can call browser fetch directly to something like Disqus or something, right? You don't need to have a serverless function, but sometimes you do, right? Search is a big one. So like we've had talks, in this conference as part of the talk about search. So how do you sort of access those APIs? Through serverless functions, potentially. Unless they have a JavaScript direct access API, right? And then anything other. So it's like, all that other stuff. So again, any static website, we're going to deploy the functions separately from our app. That's the key, right? We have two different deployments here because the static website is going to sit on its own. The functions are going to sit in its own deployment. And to make sure that these other APIs that I'm talking about here, to make sure that they should be serverless optimized or edge optimized, right? Now, this is a slightly different idea. This is hybrid plus edge. So this is the idea of like Next.js, okay? And I'm a little ignorant. There might be other frameworks that allow us to do this, but Next.js definitely is one. Of course, my doorbell is ringing. Just give me 1 second. Hey, Gemma, do you want to get the door? Okay, sorry about that. So when you think of a Next.js sort of solution, this is kind of what it looks like here. the serverless functions are actually part of the same deployment that the static files are part of, okay? And then it's kind of hard to understand, but we use browser fetch for the static files and the serverless functions, okay? Okay, my doorbell is ringing incessantly, but they're gonna have to wait. Okay. And then that serverless function is now gonna do a server-side fetch to call, again, all the APIs in the world that I just talked about, okay? So, and if we deploy something like this to Vercel or to Netlify, then you still need to have the same principles of like edge to edge as a concept, okay? So we need to make sure that those APIs that we're calling are sort of serverless optimized again, like we talked about. So if the database, it's probably gonna be Fauna, that idea, okay? So you can see how the code is kind of moving around. And as developers, you're gonna write code that runs at build time to generate the static files. You're gonna write code that runs in a serverless function to go in that serverless function. And you might end up writing code that, that does some regeneration that's in here as part of this hybrid edge website idea. So this is Next.js right now. I'm not sure if Nuxt, which is kind of similar to Next, does this. It's a good question. If you know in the comments, please let me know. You deploy the website and the functions together. So that's both awesome and potentially terrible, right? Because if I have a small fix to just one function, I got to deploy the whole website. I might not want to do that, but it also keeps it together in one bundle. So maybe I do want to do that. So that's a decision, that's your preference. But it's certainly make it a decision and make it intentional. And again, serverless optimized APIs. Happy to answer questions on what is or isn't a serverless optimized API. So then static plus cloud, okay? So now we have a static website that we generated, that we built, okay? And it could, again, could be hosted anywhere. We could use the new Azure Static Web Apps solution too. This is one where it's gonna get confusing. It's like, well, they have an offering that's all about that. Host your static website somewhere, okay? And then host serverless functions as well, but put them in the cloud provider of your choice so that we can do a server fetch within that cloud provider's sort of affinity, okay? And the reason this is so important that I have found, folks come to us and say, we already have an Azure spend. We have databases and all kinds of stuff in Azure, and we want to take advantage of that. We don't want to move to any other provider, or I already have an AWS sort of commit that I've set up or whatever. I need to take advantage of that. This is a perfect case where we do that. Or I already have a bunch of stuff that's in Azure AWS. Oh my goodness, they're not going away. You're gonna have to give me 1 second. I'm gonna mute for 1 second. Apologies. Fun. And I'm back. I just scared the gee willikers out of my daughter because she was with the noise canceling headphones. So that's always fun. Good times. Okay. Where were we? So yeah, talking about static plus cloud. So let's give a few more things about this. Remember, this could be, again, any static website. We're going to deploy these functions separately. So we're going to have separate DevOps for these functions. And those functions usually have a close affinity to those cloud resources that we were talking about. Okay. So that's a really great sort of set of things that really talk about those three different architectures. And I think there's of course a zillion different kind of implications for those different things. And there's different ways that could all work. But let's look at the idea of a headless commerce as an example, like right away, to sort of see how this might work for something like headless commerce, because this one comes up a lot. Okay. So let's talk about how that might work. Let's talk about headless commerce if it's a Next.js website, so a static website for us to think about here. So we've got Next.js where it's like we do a static build. And as that static build, remember from the first slide, one of the first slides where it has, probably going to pull content from like a CMS and probably going to pull content from my products from my e-commerce as well. So like I'm going to use a Shopify API, or Snipcart is a pretty cool headless stuff, or BigCommerce is another one. In fact, if you go to like Google Next.js Commerce as an example, there is a BigCommerce example that you can just download the code for. But so that is going to work like this, right? Where we've got the idea of so the browser fetch is at the browser fetch is going to be calling our serverless function that's going to be doing things like checkout. Okay, so if we need to, I'm kind of getting caught up in my words here. So if we need to do things like checkout, and if that needs to go through a serverless function, for instance, if we're calling Stripe, right? Or we're calling like something that needs to be a server to server call. We will do that in the browser. And it can get really confusing on how this is all working, right? So the headless commerce one, but it just falls into the same paradigm of, we're going to make a browser fetch to a serverless function. We're going to make a server fetch to call our API, which is going to include, again, our e-commerce API. But the static build pulled in all the products that we needed to basically show to our customers. And where this is really important to kind of think about, and I'm sorry that I'm tripping over my words here, is think about the idea of like a Black Friday. Okay, this is where a headless e-commerce concept, but it's like any headless concept is important. We pre-rendered the whole site. So that site is most likely not going to go down and not going to have like problems where you need to scale anything up for it to render, to just show someone the site, okay? But the thing that we need to care about scaling is that serverless function when everybody clicks checkout all at the same time because you just launched a new product, okay? So this is where important. Serverless functions have auto-scaling features. So I actually don't need to worry too much about my website going down. I need to worry more about my checkout button and make sure that that is good, because one piece of code rendered at build time, and that's not going to go down because it's build time, but the other piece of code runs at serverless in my serverless function on the server time. That's the one I need to be careful about, but there's a lot less code in there than with something like a monolithic site. So we've gone through a whole lot of concept. I talked way too fast. Apologies for that, but I'd like to continue this conversation. So let's do that. So here's my contact details. Follow me at Joel Vardy, or follow Agility at Agility CMS. Agility has a lot of events where often I'm part of that, or my colleagues, where we're just talking Jamstack, e-commerce, all these different type things. So agilitysmiths.com/events as well. I'm looking forward to speaking at the GatsbyConf in March. But you can also, email me, joel@agilitysmiths.com. I want to hear from you. I want to hear your feedback. That's, important for me to hear. And I think I did pretty good on timing. If the countdown is right, I'm doing okay. Thanks for listening. Really appreciate it. Looking forward to the questions.
Thanks, Joel. That was amazing. I think you crammed basically the best how to Jamstack summary I've ever seen into like 30 minutes, covering like every corner of possibility, because it is so much going on nowadays, especially with the addition of these hybrid options and things like that. So we do have some questions from the audience, and then I have some questions too I'd love to chat with you about.
Okay.
So
yeah, let's
so Meg asks, can you elaborate a bit more on the difference between build time APIs and serverless APIs?
Yeah, that's like, so that's key, right? So build time, think of it like this. The whole idea of static site generation is all about build time. So when I check my code in, or when I have some sort of event that happens, we need to rebuild the site to build the folder of static HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files that are going to serve my static site. Whereas serverless functions are going to get called like after that by AJAX calls. So say like a checkout call or register or login, we're going to do something after the site has already built. And this is easy to see if you're using something like Gatsby or 11T, those where you watch your console and you see is like, I go npm run build and you see a bunch of things running that console. That's build time. But your browser console is where you're going to see your example of calling those serverless functions. And the console for those will be in whatever cloud provider you're using, or it would be in like Netlify and Vercel. Both have ways of looking at those functions about their output. So if I track the console.log, I can see where they're happening.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, but it can still be confusing, I think, for somebody, especially if you're relatively new, and you're working in a tool like Next or Gatsby, and you're like console log, and you're like, it's not showing up in my command line console versus like, it's in the browser console, and even having to understand, for instance, like, this variable is available in my build, but now I need to make it available to in the browser, and it's not by default there, right? So like I have an environment.
Heart palpitations right now. It's like, my gosh, yeah, totally, absolutely. Those are the kind of problems that come up like every minute with Jamstack development.
Yeah, I wrote a post the other day. I wrote about thinking in Jamstack, which was like how I kind of put it, because
I
it's
like that.
it's more of having to try and decide. You're used to building when you're used to building like standard server rendered apps, right? It's like everything's
Yeah.
rendered, everything's done on the server. Everything's always done in
Yeah.
one place. And even when you move to like the single page application model, it's like, okay, I have this container that holds my app, but everything else gets called to the server. Like it's still a fairly simple paradigm, as opposed to like you think about a Jamstack app, and it's like, well, I can render this content either at build time. I can render this content at runtime, and now with the addition of hybrid, I can render this on the server in particular cases. So it's like, it's you have to start thinking about when is appropriate to render specific
Yeah.
content,
That's right.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
And those are
totally.
tough decisions. Those are full stack decisions.
Yeah, it's not. It's not. I mean, it's not easy. Sometimes there's not even an obvious decision, right? Like, so it's
That's right.
user generate, like user stuff that I have to look up for the user. Obviously, it's got to be on the client, right? But then lots of stuff could be build time, could be client.
Well, and we get stuck on, well, what should I do? I'm reading the Gatsby docs. So what does Gatsby tell me to do? What does Next tell me to do? And that can sometimes take us down a confusing path because we're not sure of the use case. We know our use case and we're trying to relate it to something in some docs. And that's where I think we need to reach out to a community to say, hey, what should I do here?
Yeah. So another question we got from the audience: do you find that using all of the APIs in the world, quote unquote, quickly begins to defeat the purpose of a static site in terms of page load speed?
Well, if it does, then yeah. So the page load speed shouldn't be affected by those APIs. And that should be a rule when you're building pages. So if you build a page that is slower based on an API, especially as like on loading like the content. So say you have a blog post with comments, right? And those comments are being pulled from like another API. If your page load speed relies on that other API being fast, you did it wrong. You're doing something wrong there. Okay. So it should be a good rule to say, hey, my static page builds at build time. That has to be as fast as I can. So if there's slow APIs, I probably need to think about maybe that's the wrong API. Maybe I'm doing something wrong, or maybe there's a better solution out there. And a perfect example of a legitimate problem here is I have a site with 10,000 pages potentially. Okay. That's not uncommon. Should I rebuild all of those at build time? Next.js framework says, no, rebuild a small subset of them or the newest ones or the most popular ones, and that the other ones get built as part of like an incremental build, right? So there's a couple different answers. There's an absolutely, you're using the wrong APIs, but there's also maybe you're just building too much. So again, I wish I could just say yes or no, one or the other, but it depends.
It absolutely does. I think you make a really good point. In that, in fact, most of these frameworks now have incremental builds built in to some degree or another, right? But also, a lot of these APIs, I think people get stuck in this like, oh, I call the APIs from the client side. No, I mean, you can call, a lot of these APIs are being called at build time, right? They're not necessarily all being called at client. And the ones you got to worry about in terms of the speed and stuff like that you definitely need to evaluate is, am I calling that on the client? Then obviously that speed is important. But if it's an API, like if I'm calling a CMS at build time, like, I mean, maybe it impacts my build speed, but ultimately it doesn't impact the end user at all, right?
That's right. Yeah,
so
it's important to note, like, and when you know where the code's running, if you can answer that question, oftentimes these questions get a lot easier to answer.
Yeah, exactly. So Meg asks, is the headless commerce pattern the same as the hybrid edge pattern?
I think yes. I think it's a good pattern. Hybrid is like the sort of the Next.js. I think Next.js is perfect for e-commerce, but the other patterns, it can totally work with any of the patterns. It's just easier for me to talk about it with that one. One of the reasons why I think it's good for any static site generator that's going to do e-commerce. Oftentimes e-commerce has a lot of products, especially if you're doing like a retail site or like a grocery site or something like that. You're gonna have a lot of products, which you're gonna need to render pages for, that you probably don't want to do like all in one big shot. So you need some kind of incremental build that makes it easy to work with. So Next.js is a good one for that, a good framework. But you can host it anywhere. But also, like, Gatsby is not a bad choice either, or 11t. Like, there are ways to get it to work depending on your situation. And e-commerce itself is like, if it's a big store, you need to make those right choices. You need to be okay with, like, I got it working, but I made the wrong decision, so now I need to try it again because it doesn't work with 10,000 products or 1,000,000 products or whatever. You know, how many SKUs you have makes it a big deal, and how many users you're going to get at burst time. I've been part of e-commerce builds that were like, we need you to fix our Black Friday problem. That's not an easy problem to solve, but when you do, it's like something to celebrate for sure.
Right, for sure. One of the things that I was thinking about when you during your talk was you mentioned about how Next.js builds in the functions and things like that, and I think this is one of the fundamental confusions when you come into this is like, especially if you're coming from the single page application world, where it's like, okay, you know, I'm used to calling the server to get my content to then render the page, right? And that fundamentally that is what's happening in the server side rendered Next.js app. Is I can actually deploy this to like Netlify or to Vercel, right? But like Netlify kind of makes it obvious for me. It's just creating those functions for me. Like, it's just creating Netlify functions to handle that server side rendering. It's no different than having a node server out there. It's just now done as a bunch of functions.
Yeah, we have folks, customers of ours that are running Next.js apps in Docker containers in Azure behind a CDN, and it's like this tiny Docker container because it's like running the smallest amount of code. So that's a solution that can work too. In fact, lots of folks run Next.js in a Docker container just because they have to have it. In this case, the customer had to put it in Azure. They're like, everything has to be in Azure. We have an Azure commit that we need to meet. We've already spent the money. Let's just put it in there. So a Docker container in that case works well. And it's the same code, and it's very, very portable, which is this is what I love most about Jamstack. Is it's so portable. You can take your thing, move it. I want to deploy in Vercel. Oh no, wait, that doesn't work. I want to put it in Netlify. Oh wait, it needs to be in Azure. Put it in here. I can put it in Google. I can put it in other places too. So pretty great.
True. Although, you know, on that point, each of those providers is trying to build in features that kind of make it a little bit less portable. Totally understand.
Yes.
You know, part of the business model. So
yeah, absolutely.
Okay, one other quick topic I want to talk. We got 5 minutes, so along those lines, I think I wrote a different post the other day, just kind of saying that. How do I put it? Tripping over my words now. Jamstack, right, in 2021 is basically static first, but not static only. And because you brought up the whole SSR thing, it's like we're now kind of entering this new world of Jamstack where it's like, okay, what defines Jamstack? If it includes SSR, then everybody's like, oh, but I'm doing Jamstack already. But it's like, no, okay, we are static first. We prefer static, but we use SSR like where we need to make our app work, right?
Yeah, that is a great point, and it's a great distinction. And I kind of hate that Next.js has server rendering as well. I just wish that was like gone. It's not recommended to use. I think the really interesting idea is something like incremental static regeneration, which is really a handful. But what it's done is it's actually, just as a concept, is such a great idea. It's like almost server rendered, and it basically uses the idea of a serverless function called from the client to generate that page once at runtime, only when it needs to. So it has the idea of like, am I up to date? Generates the thing and lets the CDN know all at once that it's using something called stale when revalidate to update that thing. And when I first saw it, I thought, this is black magic. There's no way this can work. They're just doing server rendering, right? Which they kind of are, but it generates that static file that lives in the server build at like regenerate time, but it only runs once. And so that you could have, 10,000 people hitting your site all at once. Only one of those requests does the build. The client calls home and says, hey, is the build finished yet? Is it okay? And it automatically updates the page, which at that point said like loading, which is like just so brilliant to make sure that like we don't have that problem of, I have 1 million products. I don't want to render all those 1 million products at build time, which is probably the biggest, this is why I need server-side rendering type problem that we see. And so that idea, Gatsby has its own solution for incremental builds where it does it a slightly different way using its GraphQL engine. Also amazing. Both of those things solve the same problem in different ways, which is to like, but it leads back, Brian, to what you're saying of like, where does my code run? How do I am I doing Jamstack right yet? And the way you're doing it could be different. So.
Yeah, we use a lot of terms in on our business, right? Like serverless, and then you use terms like serverless, and everybody's got to be like, oh, but there's servers. Yes, of course, there's servers. There's servers. Yes. It's not really serverless. We just come up with terms. Like Meg is asking, SSR is like it was when did it's one of my favorites because everybody's talking SSR now. It's like it's some new thing. I'm like, man, that's what I was doing when I got into web development 20 years ago. We didn't call it SSR back then. It was just, that was how you built sites, So
just websites, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so final question, and this is the most important and the most difficult. You got 1.5 minutes to answer it. What's your favorite musical?
Oh my goodness, this is so hard to answer. My favorite musical is always the next one that I'm going to be involved in. So I like to watch musicals, but I am part of a musical theater group. And I actually have not announced this publicly yet, but we were just about to I was about to direct. So I direct as well as I'm in musicals as well as an actor, but I was going to direct The Sound of Music. So that was the next one that was in. So I have that one kind of stuck in my head. And check this out. I actually have the script on my desk that I've been working with, and oh my gosh, I can't wait to get back to it. So The Sound of Music is my favorite one right now.
All right, so they'll have to check out to, where is it, Port Hope? Isn't that where you live, to go see you perform?
That's right, Port Hope, Cobourg area, just east of Toronto. It's great.
Well, I think we've got lots of Toronto people here, so you're going to have a following. All these Jamstack people showing up at your shows.
Let's end this pandemic and get doing musical theater again. How about that?
All right.